Hello, everybody. And today is our third part of the three-part lecture series for the land-based empires of 1450 to 1750. And today we're going to conclude Unit 3 by taking a look at the Tokugawa in Japan, the Ming and the Qing in China, and the Mughal in India. So once again, the big thing is to notice the common similarities that we see, the development of cities, the efforts to centralize the control over the people, the use of belief systems, the development of taxation systems. We want to look for those common themes throughout all of these different empires, while at the same time getting to know the individual story of each of these. So without any further ado, let's start with Japan. Now, we've talked a little bit about Japan before, and this is still in East Asia. And when we did talk about Japan, we talked about this concept of shoguns and daimyos and samurai. And so, letter A is just a little refresher for your memory. There's this concept in the 1500s that the daimyos are running the show. And the daimyo, just to refresh your memory, are the local landlords, they're the local land owners. They represent a warrior based class, but they also make a lot of their wealth and power off of land ownership. So, in this way, they're very similar to the nobles of Europe in the sense that they control a great deal of power and they enjoy a lot of autonomy and independence of action. These daimyos are going to employ their private army of samurai. So, this army is paid for and is loyal to the individual daimyo. So throughout the 1400s and the 1500s, Japan is basically a decentralized region with daimyos fighting amongst each other, daimyos exerting a great deal of independent power, and there is no central authority to speak of. And so that brings me to number two, this concept of what about the Emperor of Japan? At this point in the 1500s, the emperor has no real political or military power to speak of. So what we have in the 1500s is Japan in this state of decentralization. And that brings us to the rise of a centralizing power, the Tokugawa shogunate. And the Tokugawa shogunate is going to go from about 1590 till 1868. 1868 is a good year to end them. So they're going to run for almost 300 years. And they are going to represent kind of the government before the modernization of Japan, which we'll get to in several units from now. And it begins with a daimyo named Oda Nobunaga. He's one of the original founders of the centralized Japan. And what he does, here he is a minor daimyo, but he's a fierce and powerful warrior. And he goes after his enemies with a ferocity that hadn't been seen before. And one of the big things that gives him an edge is his use of firearms that he has secured through trade with the Europeans. So his armies are armed with gunpowder, which is a theme that we've been seeing in these land-based empires. And what he does over the period of his time in about the mid 1500s, from about 1540 to about 1570s, is he expands his control throughout much of Japan. He doesn't take all of Japan under his control, but by defeating and bringing daimyos under his control, he begins to centralize authority, particularly in the southern half of Japan. When he dies because he's betrayed by one of his generals, and there's a brief moment of kind of chaos. And one of Nobunaga's allies, one of his best generals, a man by the name of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, is going to emerge as the new centralizing figure and kind of pick up where Nobunaga had left off. So he uses military, but he also uses diplomacy, enlisting the alliances of local daimyos and not only just conquering daimyos, but also making alliances with daimyos. And through these methodologies, he begins to centralize even more power, eventually completing the unification of Japan. And then he goes one step further in about the 1580s He tries an overseas expansion of the Japanese influence, and he attempts to invade Korea on two occasions, and then is going to die during his second attempt. So here we have with Hideyoshi the centralization of Japan under one authority. What's really important to me is the law that Hideyoshi is going to pass called the sword hunt. And what he's going to do is issue an edict where he basically says, this is the way it's going to be. He forbids the ownership of firearm weapons and swords amongst the lower class. So basically, Japan has to deal with this idea that weaponry is going to be forbidden under this new central authority. And this is a way of bringing control to the potential rebellions of peasants and also potentially arming a private army amongst the daimyos. So not only do we see Hideyoshi conquering and using diplomacy to centralize authority in Japan, we also see him using the law to solidify control over Japan by taking away weapons, basically, from the people who could potentially pose a threat to this central authority. And after Hideyoshi's death, again, we have another bit of infighting amongst the daimyos. And one is going to emerge, Tokugawa Ieyasu. And Tokugawa Ieyasu is going to establish himself as the shogun. So he consolidates authority under his rule, and he takes on that title of shogun. And the shogun, if you remember from Unit 1, is the kind of the military lord or the military overlord, or the central military figure of all of Japan. And the daimyos are all going to pay respect and submission to the shogun. And then, much like Peter the Great when he builds St. Petersburg, or much like Louis XIV when he builds Versailles, Ieyasu is going to build up the city of Edo. And Edo is today referred to as Tokyo. And the building of Edo, again, centralizes authority. He's going to also use it to project power and to project strength. And one of the key things about the Edo city, this capital city, is that the daimyos are going to be forced to have a residence there in Edo, in the capital city. And they're supposed to leave their family there, which kind of gives the shogun semi-hostages. You know, just a reminder to the daimyos that punishment for disobedience can be harsh and is very nearby for the shogun. So that brings me to this idea of control over the daimyo and the samurai. So the daimyos start to get under control. They start to face more restrictions on the type of armies that they can hold and what type of military force they can bring to the capital city. And on top of that, the samurai, who used to be the private army of the daimyos, since there is no more civil wars, there's no more need for the samurai to be those private soldiers. So what the Tokugawa shogunate does is employs them as bureaucrats within the Tokugawa system. And so now that warrior class becomes paid for by the central government, which again is going to be an example of bringing the army under control of the central source and getting rid of local authorities' ability to create a military. And as we watch Japan develop later, we're going to see this constant theme of the shogun expanding their power and control over the daimyo and over the samurai. We'll get to that in Unit 4. And then number 4, if you take a look, this is actually something that Japanese school children are taught today as a way of remembering the unification of Japan. Nobunaga pounds the national rice case. Hideyoshi kneads it. And in the end, Ieyasu sits down and eats it. So these three are going to build off, eventually leading to this unification under the Tokugawa shogunate. And if you take a look, I put up these 3 pictures because this is another thing that is taught in Japan about these 3 founders. And the question becomes, if a bird doesn't sing, what do you do? Well, according to Nobunaga, you kill it. So if the bird does not sing, you kill it. According to Hideyoshi, who used diplomacy If a bird does not sing, you make it sing. So you manipulate it. You sometimes provide punishment. Sometimes you provide reward, and you get it to sing at some point. And then Tokogawa Yatsu, if the bird does not sing, you wait. And Yatsu had the ability, because he had so much power, to be patient for these last daimyos to kind of get on board with the centralized plan. So that's the three founders of Japan. I throw that out to you because it sets up some stuff in Unit 4, but also because it shows us a lot of these common trends. So going on, we now go to China. So now we're back to China. Last time we left China, it was in the hands of the Mongol dynasty, which we also call the Yan dynasty. And initially, the Mongolian dynasty of the Yan under Kublai Khan was very popular, very successful, um, built hospitals and schools and roads for the people. By the time we get to the mid 1300s, the bubonic plague is spreading throughout China, and it's causing massive famine. It's causing massive death, obviously. It's causing, it's being tied into natural disasters. For example, one of the things that the Mongols did was they cut down trees. When they cut down trees, these fields become very, what's the word I want to use? Vulnerable to flooding of rivers. The trees can break up that flooding. Open lands can be easily flooded. So what happens is that we start seeing floods that start to run over farmlands that lead to greater famine, greater problems. And if you remember all the way back to this concept of the mandate of heaven, to the people of China, the Yan dynasty has lost that mandate of heaven. And what begins is a series of rebellions that eventually topples and overthrows the Yan dynasty. And in 1368, we get a new dynasty, the Ming. Now, I don't want to step too much into modern politics, but the Ming, the best phrase you can think of, is making China Chinese again. So, with all apologies to what's going on in the political world today, this is a great way to remember what the Ming were all about. To the Ming, their job was to restore China to the Chinese way of doing things and to wipe out anything that the Mongols had done. So initially, a lot of what happens is just getting rid of the Mongolian influence, tearing down Mongolian architecture, destroying Mongolian art, wiping clean from books any references to the Mongolians, getting rid of people whose names had been linked to the Mongolian families. Anything that was Mongolian was done away with. And what returns is the Chinese way of doing things. And that means the civil service exams are going to start coming back because the Ming need a bureaucracy to run China. And they're going to just turn up, if you will, and expand the civil service exams and the bureaucracy that we saw under the Song dynasty. But another problem was a need to control corruption within the court and throughout the bureaucracies. And what the emperor of the Ming is going to do is fix it so that all the power goes directly to the emperor. He's going to start cutting out positions that could potentially hold power that would rival the Ming or the Ming emperor. He's going to put in rules requiring that emperors marry common women instead of high land-owning wealthy women in order to cut down on the palace intrigue that took place so often under the Mongolians. Another example, which I think is great, is that the Chinese bureaucrats are returning, the Confucian scholars are returning, and the Ming emperor wants to model pure behavior. And so what he does is that any bureaucratic official who is caught corrupting would be paraded, have their pants dropped, and then would be beaten in public. And sometimes that beating would result in death. But if that bureaucrat scholar survived, eventually he just became a ridicule throughout society. So this was a harsh way to make sure that corruption ended, but it was an effective way. Another thing that the Ming emperors do is they build up the city of Beijing. And again, Beijing becomes a center of power for the government. And this is a trend that we've seen throughout all the case studies we've done so far. The building up of these cities as a way of centralizing power, bringing all the workings of the government under one place and creating a symbol of the power of the government. And even within Beijing is the forbidden city that only the emperor and his family was allowed to reside in. And this becomes a symbol of the power of the Ming. And then for number five, this becomes important as well because there's financial problems for the Ming through their taxation policy. And eventually in the mid 1520s, 1530s, the Ming are going to put forth a tax policy which says they will only collect taxes in the form of silver. Now, I want you just to make a note of this because later in the next unit, we're going to be revisiting this. We're going to be talking about why this matters. But for right now, this is an example of a financial reform in order to bring some consistency to the way taxes are collected. And in fact, transforming this over to silver payments of taxes is a way of eliminating corruption. Letter C, the return of the Neo Confucianists. So, if you remember from the Song Dynasty, Neo Confucianism was the guiding philosophical and moral force of China. And what happens is that with the rebirth and expansion of the examination system, that scholar gentry class that was based out of Neo Confucianism reemerges. They become much more wealthy, they own more land, and their authority is increased under the Ming. For example, students were not allowed to question their teacher at all. And the law started to enforce that supremacy of the Confucian scholar to the point that questioning the scholar in class would result in death, as in one case, where a student was beheaded and the head was put on a pole for all the other students to remember, don't question authority. Now, what's interesting is that we look at examples like this and we think that that would make everybody not question authority. But we have to remember that these people who lived in the 1500s, 1600s, they're not much different than we are today. If there's a harsh penalty associated with something, we'll learn how to work around it. We'll learn how to take that bad behavior underground. And so it was with a lot of these Chinese students. Even though they may not have questioned the scholars directly, there was still an underground of criticism towards this group. And I just think about how relevant that is today when you look at criticisms of the Chinese government, which will throw people in jail or for criticisms like this. And yet there's an underground movement that continues to persist in the resistance. Just something for you to think about. Second, under the Ming Dynasty, foot binding begins to make a comeback. If you remember, the Mongolians rejected foot binding. Foot binding here under the Ming begins to make a comeback, much to the chagrin of many Chinese women. Now, letter D is something that I want you to pay particular attention to. And I want you to star this because this will often come up on AP exams with the Ming Dynasty. There is a Chinese admiral named Qing who begins a series of 7 expeditions from 1405 to 1433. And the motivations of these expeditions is to increase Chinese power throughout Eurasia, particularly through the Indian Ocean. This is not to say that China is colonizing or China is conquering. These expeditions were set up to remind the Eurasian world that China was a force to respect and to submit to. And so now we get back to that whole tributary tradition. People wanted to trade with China. China kind of develops this attitude of if you want to do business with us, you need to show your inferiority or your submission to us through a variety of rituals. Now, in a lot of ways, the Yan dynasty, the Mongols, had ended this. What these expeditions were meant to do was kind of to revive the 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 awe that China should inspire in other states. And if you take a look at the top map that has the years and the dotted lines, these show five of the major expeditions that was led by the Ming Chinese. And you can see the extent of the expeditions. These expeditions make their way to Southeast Asia, to South Asia, to the Middle East, to the Swahili city states of East Africa, basically throughout the Indian Ocean basin. Now, again, China doesn't conquer these regions. They don't set up Chinese states. What they do is they start to increase trade with China and they start to create a strong presence throughout the Indian Ocean. And then in 1433, for whatever reason, the expeditions come to an end. There's really no explanation of why. A lot of theories is that the Confucian scholars looked down on the merchant community and did not see the value in continuing to establish this trade. And so when the emperor who sponsored the expeditions died, the next emperor wasn't somebody really interested in keeping up. And he listened to the Confucian advisors who said, this is a waste of money. This is a waste of resources. This is going against our philosophy of life. The second theory is that there was greater concern with dealing with the nomadic groups that had always persisted to be a problem with the Ming to the north and to the west. In other words, the Ming spent a lot of resources getting rid of the Mongols. They didn't want to see another nomadic group come back and conquer them. So the funding for the expeditions was taken away and was sent over to defense walls such as the Great Wall. The Great Wall has been built throughout the centuries in China. What the Ming are able to do is complete the Great Wall. And with the completion of the Great Wall, this is a defensive fortification against the northern and western nomadic groups. And that is most likely the reason for the end of the expeditions is that court politics convinced the emperor, who was not the originator of the expeditions, to redirect resources to defenses against the nomadic peoples. Now, if you look at the picture at the bottom, this just gives you an idea of the scale of the expeditions. The large ship is one of the Chinese ships that would be out, one of the Chinese treasure ships. And these treasure ships brought back a variety of things from all over the Indian Ocean basin. And, tribute to be paid to the Chinese emperor as a way of developing and formalizing trade relations. And then if you look at the small boat represents the Santa Maria, the boat of Christopher Columbus. So oftentimes you'll see a picture like this to sort of reinforce this idea of just how wealthy the Chinese were compared to the regions of West Europe. Now we go from the Ming to the Qing. So the Ming dynasty gets a series of emperors who are not up to the task. They are incompetent. They ignore dealing with the people's problems. They become more insulated in their forbidden city. The court prestige or the palace prestige starts to kick up. There's infighting. Corruption begins to grow because nobody's really paying attention to the bureaucracy. And since public works are being neglected, you start to see a rise in floods and famines, and basically everything falls apart. And of course, once that happens, what do the people conclude? The Ming have lost the mandate of heaven, and rebellions begin to pop up. Now, this creates chaos in about the 1600s. While that is happening, while the Ming are falling apart, to the northeast of China is a group of people called the Manchu. And if you look at the map that's featured on the right, the Manchu are coming out of that region of Manchuria. So if you take a look at that shaded pink area, that's Manchuria. That's where the Manchu begin. They begin as a nomadic people. And then they begin to expand, and you can see their expansion throughout all of that pink. And that pink represents the Manchu Empire. A leader is going to unify different tribes together. a lot like Genghis Khan does, and he's going to establish a powerful empire. And what this powerful empire to the north of the Ming is doing is adopting Chinese ways of doing things. The Manchu leader models himself as an emperor. They start to build in a civil service based bureaucracy. And by 1644, this is a formidable state of a nomadic people that looks and copies themselves off of the Chinese, which brings me to number two. This group is powerful. If you take a closer look, look at the separation between the purple and the pink. That's the Great Wall of China. And the Great Wall of China is doing its job, is preventing the Manchu from invading China during this vulnerable time. But in one of the northern provinces, a rebellion breaks out, and the general in charge of the province panics, and he opens the gate to allow the Manchu to come in. And what he does is he invites them in to help suppress the rebellion. And what the Manchu end up doing is going, you know what? We'll go ahead and just take everything over. And if you look at all that purple, that's the expansion of the Manchu Empire. And by about 1644, the Ming Emperor has been displaced. The Manchu has established their own emperor, and we have the birth of the Qing dynasty, which is going to be the last dynasty of China, ending in 1911. So now, if you take a look at that pink and that purple, that's the Qing dynasty in 1644. You can kind of look at the years as they expand south, taking over what has traditionally been China for millennia. What the Manchu are going to do is, in order to rule this territory, they are going to maintain the Chinese ways. Remember, they modeled themselves after the Chinese traditions. So they're going to keep the civil service exams. They're going to allow the Chinese Confucian scholars to maintain important positions within the government. They're not going to interfere with what's going on in China in terms of the political workings of China, because the Qing represent 2% of the population, whereas the native Han Chinese represent the other 98. So you're talking about a mismatch. So what the Manchu do is they incorporate local practices. They also, if you take a look at the map, they expand into the nomadic tribes. They go into that big chunk of yellow and they conquer the nomadic tribes. And basically, if you look at this map, this is what modern day China looks like for the most part. These are its borders. And when they go into these nomadic territories, the Qing have the advantage of gunpowder weapons, which gives them an edge, obviously, in defeating and bringing under control of the nomadic tribes. But what's interesting is that even though they militarily control the nomadic tribes, they work with local leaders to run the show. And for the most part, leave these local leaders be. As long as the local leaders are paying their taxes and obeying basic Chinese or Qing law, they are allowed to practice their laws and their traditions and their customs. And in fact, the Qing go out of their way to prevent Chinese settlers from going into these nomadic territories. So again, you get back to this idea that the Qing figure out that the best way to control a group of people is to give them some slack and allow them to maintain their traditional practices to an extent. And that's a very common practice of most empires. The impositions on the Chinese, while they may be giving slack and incorporating local traditions, they also impose on the Chinese. One of the way they impose is on the hairstyle. So the Manchurians, and maybe you've seen this style before, the Manchurians have a hairstyle of shaving the front of their head and then allowing the back hair to grow long and putting it into a braid. And what they do is they force all Chinese males to start shaping their hair much the same way as the Manchu. So they're taking the Manchu hairstyle and imposing it onto the Chinese men. Another way, and I'll talk about this in another slide, is the introduction and imposition of Manchu dress and Manchu fashion. And what's interesting is that this Manchu fashion is going to be forced onto the Confucian bureaucrats and onto the court officials, Chinese or Manchu. But eventually, the common people will start adopting this as well, showing us just how complete this control of the Manchu is, or control by the Manchu is. And I bring these things up to show you that sometimes we can see centralization and control in everyday things like clothing fashion. Which brings me to my last thing, the population growth. During the Qing dynasty, the population of China will triple. It will go over the course of about, well, 250 years. It will triple in size. And again, thinking back to, wait for it, Champa rice, we have an agricultural reform that is able to sustain this population growth. But instead of it being Champa rice, it is American crops, the potato and maize or corn. What has happened is that there's been a global integration of the Americas with Eurasia. And one of the things getting introduced throughout Afro-Eurasia are American-based crops, such as the potato and corn. Potato is the big one. And those crops are going to work their way into China. And those crops can be grown in much, much rougher terrain, which allows for a larger food supply, which of course leads to a larger population. We're going to talk more about that point another time, but I want you to see that is happening. Now, I just want to do a side mention for those of you who might find this interesting. The evolution of Chinese fashion. So unfortunately, I am covering up the transformation over to the Qing. But if you take a look at the first woman in her green dress, purple top, the long pink sleeves, that is from the Ming Dynasty. And then if you look directly below her, that is from the Qing Dynasty. And if you take a look at the jacket, if you look at the top and kind of how it's cut over, almost like a jacket, as opposed to, it's something that you would button up on the side. That actually becomes the basis for fashion we associate with China today. So if you take a look at how it evolves up to the modern day, you kind of see that high collar with kind of the close cut. That evolves from the Manchu horseback riders days. Those were the vests, jackets that they wore while they wore horses. If you take a look at the black and white photo directly under the title, you can see that it also applied to men. So when you look at these styles of dress, which we typically associate with Chinese fashion, realize that they are a result of the Manchurian conquest and establishment of the Qing dynasty. And that's just another example of how we can see in everyday things the idea of cultural diffusion and the idea of how states are able to centralize their authority. In some ways, is by imposing or coercing their tastes onto the controlled population. But that's a little bit more advanced. It's just a little extra information. Let's get to our last one, the Mughal Empire of South Asia, which we usually associate with India. But really, India and Pakistan are the two countries we want to think of. So the origins of the Mughal Empire is a lot like the origins of the Safavid and the Ottomans. A Turkish group is going to emerge and begin a series of conquests. And there is a leader, Babur, who is a Turkish descendant, claims legacy from Genghis Khan, and he is going to intervene into a civil war. He comes rolling in and is one of the great examples of how history is progressing. And this is going to get you to the conquest of Delhi. But if I go back for a second, Babur is not only Turkic, but he's also Muslim. But he's not going in to create an Islamic state. If you remember, the Ottoman Empire saw themselves as holy warriors of Allah, and they represented the champions of Sunni Islam. The Safavid saw themselves as holy warriors of Allah and saw themselves as the champions of the Shiite version of Islam. Even though Babur is Sunni, it's not a motivation. He's going in for political reasons. He has his own little kingdom, that's based out of modern day Pakistan, Afghanistan. And he's going into a neighboring kingdom in order to bring some order. And what he begins to do is go through a series of expansions, culminating in the conquest of the city of Delhi. In 1526, Babur and his cannons come rolling in up against the Delhi prince, who comes out with his elephants and his warriors armed with bows and arrows and spears and swords. And the elephant, the war elephant, has been a staple of South Asian military technique for centuries. And as soon as the cannons roar, the elephants turn around and begin to run. And that leads to a total collapse of the Delhi army. And eventually, Babur conquers Delhi and begins to establish the Mughal Empire. Now, and if you think about the word Mughal, it kind of refers to the great ones, to the powerful ones. And that's where you get to Akbar. So there's some successors of Babur that I'm skipping. The next big ruler to recognize is Akbar the Great or Akbar the First. And what he does is he increases central control over the increasing size of the Mughal Empire. So he begins to establish a stronger bureaucracy. And if you remember, one of the things about South Asia is that they've always had this idea of regional kingdoms who kind of do their own thing politically and culturally. And what Akbar is doing is exerting more central authority over those regional kingdoms, either through alliances or through military conquest. And what Akbar is able to do is expand the Mughal Empire south through India. So the strength of the Mughal Empire is in the north and the west, basically what is today Pakistan. But the control of South Asia expands under Akbar. So he's once again using the military, just like we've seen with Hideyoshi, like we saw with the Qing, like we saw with, I'm trying to think, with the Songhai, what we saw with the Ottomans and the Safavid, what we saw with Russians. This central military force is beginning to exert more control over a larger region. And those local nobles are being brought under control. And those local nobles are losing the ability to maintain private armies, which is going to just increase the power of Akbar even more. What's interesting about Akbar, and this is the big one, this is the one you want to star, and this is what you want to associate with the whole of the Mughal Empire, is his religious tolerance. Actually, he was fascinated with non-Muslim religions. And one of the things, even though Akbar is Muslim, he is going to incorporate Hindu practices into his court. He's going to construct buildings based off of Hindu architecture and cultural values. And we're going to see this acceptance of Hinduism by Akbar. In fact, Akbar is going to have wives who one wife was Christian, one wife was Hindu, one wife was Muslim. He has multiple wives, obviously, and he marries a variety of religions. He has advisors who come from Hinduism. So what's been interesting so far is we've talked about this role of religious tolerance. And when we looked at the Safavid, there is a great deal of religious intolerance. With the Ottomans, there is religious tolerance. With the Mughals, especially under Akbar, there is religious acceptance. And that's the big thing to know. So he's going to dress in the fashion of South Asia, in the fashion of Hinduism. He's going to promote the building of temples for Hinduism. And that kind of gets me ahead of the game. Take a look at letter A under number 3, the divine faith. One of the things that Akbar does is he takes elements of Islam and Hinduism and puts it together into a state religion called the divine faith. Great example of syncretism. Really doesn't have anybody join in with him, but it is an example of how he tries to reconcile these two very different religions. And when I look at the treatment of the Hindus, I mentioned the building of temples, bringing in Hindu or Indian musicians into the court. here's a Muslim celebrating and participating in non-Muslim religious traditions and supporting it. He's going to translate Hindu stories into Persian and Arabic. He's going to promote the arts and have those arts reflect Hinduism as well as Islam. And then he's also going to apply the non-Muslim tax. Actually, I apologize. He's going to end the non-Muslim tax on the Hindus. So where in the Ottoman Empire, Christians and Jews had to pay a tax, under Akbar, the Hindus did not have to pay this tax, showing you furthermore just how tolerant he was of the variety of religions. The other thing that we want to put in is the use of a group of people called the zamindar for tax collection. So again, we have this idea that one of the things that central governments have to do is collect taxes. So we saw how in the Ottoman Empire, there's that use of the devshirme system to create the bureaucracy to do just that, to create a group loyal to the Sultan. The Ming essentially do that with the restoration of the civil service exam-based bureaucracy. We see that in Europe with the creation of positions like bailiffs and justices of the peace, whose job it is to enforce central tax laws and central laws. The zamindar are local regional leaders that the Mughal are going to incorporate into the bureaucracy. So what happens is the Mughals, the emperor says to these local landowners and these local land leaders, regional princes in some case, they say, look, we'll let you have the land, we'll let you keep the wealth, we'll let you have some autonomy and power. You need to collect taxes for us. So they create a partnership with the local leadership. And the zamindars are going to obviously increase in power. And this again plays into a theme of all of these, is that when the central powers emerge, they show favoritism to people who cooperate with them. And those people who cooperate with them elevate in social status. And that's something to keep in mind all throughout this unit. And then I want you to look at the architecture on the right, the Taj Mahal. This is constructed after Akbar's death. I don't remember the particular Mughal emperor who comes along and does it, but he continues a lot of Akbar's policies. And the building of the Taj Mahal, this is an example of a mausoleum. A mausoleum is basically a burial place. It's a grave, it's a tomb. And this was built for the emperor's wife. And obviously he loves her a lot. So the Taj Mahal, if you look at it, the use of white marble, that definitely comes from South Asian Hinduism tradition. The opulence of it, I mean, just the decorative nature, that definitely comes from the Hindu tradition. Islam did not really allow for such extravagant burials. So it's interesting that here's a faith, Islam, that the Mughal emperor represents, that says you don't build huge graves because basically you're making an idol out of yourself. And here we see the Taj Mahal is a rejection of that idea by a Muslim leader. That once again shows us syncretism. So again, if you look at the dome, that is definitely a Persian influence combining with Islamic influences. This architecture, is meant to signify power of the central state, but it also shows a syncretism in the combination of both Islamic, Turkish, and Hinduism or South Asian cultures. Now we get to our final leader, a guy by the name of Aurangzeb. And Aurangzeb is going to start to see the downfall of the Mughal Empire. So his big problem is that there are corruptions going on within the Mughal Empire. Those zamindars are taking advantage of their position, and Aurangzeb is unable to fix those problems. He's unable to reform the system that's under him, which is going to create greater dissent and greater discontent with the Mughal emperor from the local peoples. And then Aurangzeb, he's got to go deal with uprisings. He's got to deal with resistant groups, and it begins a policy of military expansion. And of course, military expansion requires funding. To get funding, you need taxes. If you want to expand more than you've been doing, you've got to raise taxes, which is never a winning case for an emperor's popularity. And so what happens is that there's greater resistance to Aurangzeb. And on top of that, to make things worse, we see a religious intolerance towards the Hinduism faith from Aurangzeb. He gets rid of all those court musicians. He's going to destroy some temples. He's going to reimpose the non-Muslim tax. And what this does by 1707, which is when Aurangzeb dies, is he created this greater animosity between the Mughal leadership and the Hinduism of the nation. And that tension and that resentment is something that's going to play out over the next 3 centuries. Still continues to play out today. But what we want to leave India with is this Mughal empire that is weakening. The other thing you want to keep in mind is that unlike the Ottomans and unlike the Safavid, the Mughal empire is an Islamic state ruling over a majority of people who are not Muslim. So they have to deal with a whole different situation than the Ottomans or the Safavid. And we're going to leave the Mughal Empire here. And in fact, what we're going to do is, now that we're done with this, the Mughal Empire, the Songhai, the Safavid, the Ottomans, the Tokugawa shogunate, those are the 5 big Afro-Eurasian empires. And then you can throw in Russia and the West European states that we're going to talk more about next unit. And I feel like there should be one more there, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. But those 7 regions, 5 of those are non-European. And 5 of them going into the 1700s are going to change dramatically because of European contact. But that's for the next unit. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, as always, make sure you make any notes that you need to ask questions and follow up in class. And the next lecture will be posted next week as we start into Unit 4. In the meantime, all the best to you. I hope you guys are safe and well, and I'll see you again. Bye.